For Sarah and me, escaping the city wasn't just an idea, it was an obsession. The endless traffic jams of Dallas, the frantic pace, and the stifling monotony of office life had eroded our joy for living. We were searching for something more, something that could reignite our sense of adventure and connect us to a world beyond screens. It was Sarah who suggested exploring Black Ridge Forest in Colorado. The name conjured images of majestic peaks, vast stretches of forest, and the kind of silence only nature can offer. We didn't hesitate. We packed our bags, ignored our friends' warnings, and set off. After all, what could go wrong on such a well-planned getaway? For the first few days, everything went exactly as we'd imagined. The crisp, invigorating mountain air, the scent of pine trees, and the breathtaking views of peaks veiled in a light mist made us feel we'd made the right choice. That first night, we camped in a safe spot, sticking to marked trails and the advice of other hikers we knew. But deep down, that wasn't what we truly wanted. We admitted this to each other while having dinner around a campfire. "Mark," Sarah said thoughtfully, staring into the embers, "I want more. I want a real adventure, something that doesn't follow a script." I smiled, knowing exactly what she meant. I replied with a suggestion that changed everything. "What if we take one of the less-traveled trails tomorrow? Something off the tourist maps." She hesitated for a moment, but then her eyes lit up with that spark of adrenaline that bound us together. "Yes," she said with conviction. The next morning, we packed up and ventured down a smaller, almost hidden trail. As we progressed, the vegetation grew denser, and signs of other campers began to vanish. We passed tranquil streams, towering trees, and an almost otherworldly silence. Hours later, we stumbled upon a small village on the edge of the forest. The locals eyed us curiously, and with a hint of apprehension. While buying supplies in a tiny shop, an elderly woman with gray hair approached us. "You shouldn't venture deeper into the forest," she said firmly. "There are wild animals and other things that can cause trouble." "What kind of trouble?" I asked, laughing nervously. She hesitated before continuing. "Illegal loggers and other things. It's not safe." We thanked her for the warning, but dismissed it. The idea of animals or rumors about loggers seemed like an exaggeration meant to deter curious tourists. We laughed about it as we left. The trail gradually disappeared, and we found ourselves surrounded by dense trees. The birdsong was replaced by an oppressive silence. By midday, we stumbled across signs of human activity. Fallen trees and freshly cut branches. The air carried the strong scent of newly chopped wood. Shortly after, we encountered a group of men armed with rifles and machetes, their clothes dirty and their expressions weary. They looked visibly uneasy at the sight of us. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, asked curtly, "What are you doing here?" "We're just hikers," I explained, "looking for a place to camp." The men exchanged uncomfortable glances before the tall one warned us. "It's not safe. There are things in this forest no one should see. Turn back while you can." Something in his eyes looked more frightened than hostile. Sarah squeezed my hand, nervous, but we pressed on, ignoring the warning. That night we found a clearing near a stream and set up camp. The forest silence was deafening, almost unsettling. While Sarah tried to mask her unease, I couldn't shake the men's warning from my mind. In the middle of the night we heard strange sounds. Soft footsteps, as if something or someone was circling our tent. We convinced ourselves it was just nocturnal animals. But at dawn, the silence was shattered by a distant gunshot. "It's probably a hunter," Sarah murmured, trying to sound nonchalant. Another shot rang out, then several more, as if something was being chased. But when the gunfire ceased, the silence returned, heavier than before. The next day, we ventured even deeper into the forest until we found something we couldn't ignore. Enormous footprints, a mix of paw and hand-like impressions. The tracks were far too large to belong to any animal we knew. "This isn't normal," Sarah whispered, uneasy. I agreed, but pushed us forward, trying to dismiss the growing sense of dread. As night fell again, the sounds of the forest grew more distinct. Footsteps, guttural noises, And finally, something that chilled us to the bone. A voice perfectly mimicked the tone of the man who had warned us, "Turn back now. It's not safe." But the voice was distorted, almost inhuman. The sounds around the campsite grew more intense, as though something or someone was circling us. The distorted voice we had heard the night before echoed in our minds, repeating the same phrase, "Turn back now, it's not safe." Sarah and I barely slept. Every noise, a branch snapping, the rustle of leaves, made our hearts race. By morning, the atmosphere felt even more oppressive. The sun, which should have illuminated our path, barely penetrated the dense canopy, leaving us in a constant twilight. As we packed up the campsite, we found something that made our unease worse. Near where our backpacks had been, there were deep marks in the ground. They were the same enormous footprints we had seen before, half humanoid, half animal, and they had now circled our tent. "Mark, we need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. I agreed, but we couldn't just retrace our steps. Something told us we wouldn't be alone if we did. We decided to move forward, hoping we'd eventually find another village or a main trail. However, the forest seemed to grow denser and more oppressive. The silence was so absolute that even our footsteps felt intrusive. Around midday, we came across another sign of human presence, abandoned tools, including chainsaws and handsaws, all left in a rush. Some were still full of fuel, ready to use, but the area was completely deserted. "Why would they leave everything like this?" Sarah asked, looking around. Before I could answer, we noticed scratch marks on several nearby trees. They were deep gouges, as if something had passed through, leaving a trail of destruction. By late afternoon, our discomfort turned to pure fear. The forest silence was shattered by a distant noise, heavy footsteps accompanied by a low, guttural growl. We froze in place, holding our breath, but the sounds grew closer. "Run," I whispered, grabbing Sarah's hand. We ran as fast as we could, dodging branches and fallen logs. Behind us, the sound of footsteps grew louder, as if something massive was pursuing us. Suddenly, we burst into a clearing, where we stopped to catch our breath. The noise had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Then we heard the voice again, now much closer. "If you're smart, leave the forest now." This time, the voice didn't come from any specific direction. It seemed to echo from all around, distorted, almost metallic. Sarah started crying, and I knew we had to leave immediately. Night fell before we could find a way out. We set up camp in silence, but we didn't dare light a fire. We tried convincing ourselves we were safe, but the sounds around us wouldn't let us relax. Around midnight, we heard the sound of something heavy approaching again. The ground trembled slightly, and there were scratching noises outside the tent. I held Sarah's hand as she tried to muffle her sobs. Suddenly, something began hitting the tent forcefully, clawing at the fabric and letting out low, guttural growls. We squeezed our eyes shut, hoping it would go away, but the sound persisted. Then we heard gunshots, loud and rapid, cutting through the silence. Whatever had been attacking us retreated, letting out a high-pitched, inhuman scream. We scrambled out of the tent to find a group of armed loggers, their faces tense and weapons at the ready. The leader of the group, the same man who had warned us earlier, glared at us. "I told you. That thing wanted to take you." The men explained that the creature inhabiting the forest was a skinwalker, a being that guarded the area and attacked those who disrespected its territory. The offerings they usually left to keep it at bay were no longer working, and the creature had grown more aggressive. 2 of their colleagues had recently vanished, including the man who had warned us in the village. "You need to leave now," he said, pointing toward a trail that would lead us out of the forest. The next morning, we followed their directions, grateful for their help. Each step out of the forest felt like shedding a massive weight. Yet the feeling of being watched didn't leave us. Before we fully exited, I glanced back one last time. In the shadows of the trees, I could swear I saw something. A tall, distorted figure with glowing eyes watching me. "Mark, let's go," Sarah called, her voice trembling. We returned to civilization, but we could never forget what happened in Black Ridge Forest. To this day, I avoid any mention of the place. Nature holds its secrets, and some of them are better left undisturbed. I'll never forget that night. For any veteran trucker like me, the solitude of the open road is an old companion. But that night, something very different happened to me, something I've never been able to explain. I was heading home, driving along the long and desolate Highway 285 in New Mexico. It was the kind of night where the road seemed endless, and the weight of exhaustion pressed down on my shoulders like a stone. The dashboard lights illuminated the cab, and the radio, my faithful companion, played songs I barely registered. I stopped at a lonely rest area to stretch my legs and grab some coffee. The air was cold and the sky was clear, filled with stars. That's when I noticed a man walking toward me. He was trudging along the roadside, carrying a worn backpack and wearing a crumpled hat. "Hey, buddy," he called out, his voice rough and a little desperate. "Could you give me a ride to the next station? My car broke down and I'm stranded out here." I hesitated. I knew picking up strangers wasn't ideal, but something in his voice, a mix of need and desperation, convinced me. I waved him into the cab. "What's your name?" I asked as he climbed in. "John," he replied. "Thanks a lot, man. It's freezing out here." At first, the conversation was friendly. John seemed like a simple guy, but there was a strange melancholy in his words. He mentioned he was headed to Santa Fe to deal with some family matters. When I pressed for details, he turned his gaze to the window as if avoiding the topic. "Family can be complicated," he finally said, stroking what appeared to be a photograph in his hand. I glanced briefly at what he was holding. It was an old black and white photo of a woman with a sad smile. The radio began to crackle. I turned the dial, trying to adjust the frequency, but only managed to get more static. "Strange. It never acts up here," I muttered. John didn't respond. He just stared at the road, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard lights. A few hours later, he suggested we stop at a diner he claimed was just ahead. "The coffee there is great," he said with a tone of nostalgia. What struck me as odd was that I'd never noticed a diner on this route before, and I knew it like the back of my hand. Still, I agreed. I could use the rest and a good cup of coffee. Minutes later, the diner's lights came into view. It was a small place with a flickering neon sign. "Diner 66, the sign read. A few old cars were parked outside, and the facade had a retro vibe, as if it had been plucked straight from the 1950s. We walked in together. The place was surprisingly busy for the hour. A waitress approached us with a smile that felt more automatic than genuine. "What'll it be?" she asked, jotting notes on a small pad. "Coffee for me," I said. "And you, John?" "The same," he replied, but his eyes were fixed on something at the back of the diner. I turned to look but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just an old jukebox playing a slow, melancholic tune. As we waited, an odd feeling filled the air. The coffee arrived, but the smell seemed wrong. It carried a metallic scent, like rusted iron. A shiver ran down my spine. I glanced at John, who now looked serious, as if he'd noticed it too. "We need to leave," he said suddenly, leaving his coffee untouched. "What? We just got here," I protested. He didn't answer, just gave me a look that made me uneasy. I paid quickly and we left. Back in the truck, everything felt different. The air was heavy, and the engine, which usually started on the first try, sputtered a few times before roaring to life. We drove in silence, but something about John had changed. He seemed tense, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if something was following us. "Did you see that?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. "See what?" I replied, confused. He shook his head as if deciding it was better not to explain. "Just drive." So I did. I kept my eyes on the road but couldn't help glancing in the rearview mirror. In the distance, I could still see the diner's flickering sign, but for a brief moment, I swear I saw something else. A tall, shadowy figure standing in the parking lot, staring directly at the truck. I pretended I hadn't seen it and focused on the road, but my heart was pounding like a drum. A short while later, John asked to be dropped off at a gas station, saying he'd handle the rest of the trip from there. When I stopped, he got out quickly, but before leaving, he left something on the passenger seat. It was the photograph he'd been holding earlier. When I looked up again, he was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. That night still haunts me. I've never been able to find Diner 66 again or figure out who John really was. But every time I drive down Highway 285, I feel a presence, as if something or someone is still watching me. After John disappeared at the gas station, the unease stayed with me. The photo he'd left on the passenger seat seemed to call out to me. I held it in my hands and studied it more closely. It was an old, black and white photo of a woman with a melancholic expression. On the back, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "To John, with eternal love. Emily, 1956. A chill ran through me. Who was Emily? And why had John been carrying this photo on such a strange night? I needed to keep driving. I started the truck, but the engine sputtered before finally roaring to life. The road ahead felt darker and more desolate than before, and the radio was still nothing but static. To make matters worse, a thick fog began to form, reducing visibility to just a few meters. As I drove, the unsettling feeling that I was being followed grew stronger. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the road behind me was empty. Still, the sensation gnawed at me as if something unseen was watching my every move. Then I heard it, a faint whisper coming from the radio amidst the static. The voice was low, almost imperceptible, but it seemed to say my name. Michael. My heart raced. I quickly turned off the radio, but the whisper continued, now coming from somewhere inside the cab. Michael, you need to go back. Gripping the wheel tightly, I focused on the road. There was no way I was going back, to that gas station, that diner, or to John. All I wanted was to get off this cursed highway. Not long after, I spotted the lights of another gas station. Relief washed over me. Perhaps this was my chance to escape the nightmare. I pulled in and parked, still clutching the photo. Inside the convenience store, a wiry man with gray hair stood behind the counter, flipping through a newspaper. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound calm. "Evening," he replied, not looking up. I placed the photo on the counter. "Do you know this man?" "He got out at the last station but vanished." The attendant glanced at the photo and his expression instantly changed. He picked it up gingerly as though it might shatter and studied it for a long moment. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. I explained everything, picking up John, the diner, the photo he'd left behind. The attendant shook his head, incredulous. "That's not possible," he murmured. "John and Emily died on this highway over 60 years ago. It was a bad accident near mile marker 104. My blood ran cold. "You're saying he's..." The man nodded slowly. "People have reported picking him up before. He always appears to weary truckers, especially at night. And he always leaves something behind, like he's trapped between this life and the next." I left the station trembling, still holding the photo. The man advised me not to look back as I drove, but of course I couldn't help myself. A few miles later, the fog grew even thicker, and I started hearing whispers again. This time the voices weren't calling my name. They were crying. The sound seemed to come from all directions. Then the radio turned on by itself, playing the same slow, mournful tune that had played at the diner. I tried to turn it off, but the buttons wouldn't respond. That's when I saw it in the rearview mirror, something that nearly made me lose control of the truck. John was sitting in the passenger seat again. He stared at me, but his face was no longer human. His eyes were dark voids, and a twisted grin stretched across where his mouth should have been. "You shouldn't have come, Michael," he said, his voice echoing like thunder. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, desperate to escape. The truck felt sluggish, as though an invisible force was holding it back. The music grew louder, almost deafening, and the cab lights flickered erratically. Suddenly, everything stopped. The truck skidded off the road, but miraculously, it didn't crash. I climbed out to check my surroundings, only to find the highway eerily empty. There was no sign of John, the diner, or anything out of the ordinary. I got back into the truck, exhausted and shaken. The photo of Emily was still on the passenger seat, but now something was different. In the background of the image, a shadowy figure stood behind Emily, its eyes glowing in the darkness. Since that night, I've avoided driving on Highway 285 after dark. I never saw John again, but his presence still haunts me. There's something on that road that doesn't belong to this world, something that waits patiently for those foolish enough to pass through. My name is Robert Hall, and I've spent my entire life in the heart of Montana. I'm a lumberjack and carpenter, just like my father before me, and his father before him. From a young age, I learned to respect the forest, to listen to its sounds and silences. To some, these trees are just timber waiting to be cut, but to me, they have a life of their own. That day began like any other. I woke before sunrise. The morning air was cold and the sky was slowly brightening. My wife, Linda, was still asleep as I donned my hat, adjusted my machete, and left the wooden house we had built together. My dog, Duke, followed me as always, wagging his tail eagerly for another day in the clearing where I usually worked. The spot was an hour's walk from home, but I knew the path by heart. The forest around me felt calm, filled with the usual sounds of the wind through the trees and birds chirping. I chose a tree I had marked the week before. It was tall, healthy, and ready to be felled. As I prepared my tools, I heard something unusual, a sharp, constant sound like a whistle, coming from all directions. I stopped and looked around. Duke was alert too, his ears perked up. It wasn't the sound of a bird or the wind, and it unsettled me. I decided to ignore it and continued working, but the sound persisted. In fact, it seemed to grow louder. When I finally decided to investigate, I noticed Duke acting strangely. He paced back and forth, his nose low to the ground, sniffing the air. I followed him into the forest, thinking it might just be a small animal. But as we ventured deeper, the sound grew closer, surrounding us. The vegetation became thicker, and sunlight barely filtered through the canopy. With each step, the sense that something was wrong grew stronger. It felt as though the forest around me was alive, watching my every move. Suddenly, Duke stopped. His fur bristled, and he began growling softly. I scanned the area, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then, the sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was almost deafening. A shiver ran down my spine. Something in the atmosphere had shifted. The forest no longer felt like the familiar place I had known all my life. I decided to head back home, but I realized I had wandered farther than I thought. The path seemed unfamiliar, as though the trees had rearranged themselves. Duke walked ahead of me, but even he seemed unsure of where we were. Finally, after what felt like hours, I emerged from the woods and reached the edge of the clearing where my house stood. My wife was outside near the chicken coop gathering eggs. When she saw me, her expression changed. "Robert, are you okay?" she asked, dropping the basket. I just nodded, not wanting to worry her, but Linda knew me too well. She could tell something was wrong. "Did something happen? You're so pale." "It's nothing," I lied, though the truth was I was still trying to process what had happened. That night, as we sat down for dinner, I told her about the strange sound and how the forest had felt different. To my surprise, Linda had her own story to share. "This morning, while you were in the forest, I heard a strange sound too," she said hesitantly. "It was like a whistle coming from everywhere. And the chickens, they just froze, like they were in a trance." A chill ran through me. It was impossible to ignore the connection between what I had experienced in the forest and what Linda had witnessed at home. We decided not to dwell on it, convincing ourselves it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The forest I thought I knew so well was hiding a secret, and perhaps I had ventured too close to uncovering it. The following days were strange. Although Linda and I tried to return to our routine, something lingered in the air, like a shadow that couldn't be seen but could be felt. The sounds of the forest had changed. The morning birdsong, once a constant, had vanished, replaced by a heavy, unsettling silence. One night I woke with a weight on my chest. Opening my eyes, I saw Duke sitting by the bedroom door, staring intently down the dark hallway. He wasn't growling or barking. He was completely still, like a statue. "Duke, what's wrong, boy?" I whispered, but he didn't respond. I got up, grabbed the flashlight I kept by the bed, and stepped into the hallway. The silence was so profound I could hear my own breathing. At the end of the hallway, I noticed the back door was ajar. Something told me not to go outside, but curiosity got the better of me. When I opened the door fully, the forest looked different under the pale moonlight. The trees were shrouded in a thin mist that seemed to pulse, almost as if it were alive. And then I heard it. The sound. The whistle. That same whistle I'd heard days ago echoed through the forest, but this time it was closer. It felt as though the night itself had found a voice, a constant whisper calling out to me. Without thinking, I started walking toward the sound with Duke close at my heels. The vegetation was denser than I remembered, and each step seemed to draw me further into the darkness. The whistle grew louder, filling my head with a mix of fear and fascination. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into a clearing. At its center, something made me stop in my tracks. A circle of ancient stones covered in moss stood around a small fire burning in the middle. There was no one in sight. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice small and fragile against the vast silence. No one answered. Only the whistle remained, now so loud it felt like it was coming from inside me. Suddenly, Duke began barking furiously. He was fixated on the edge of the clearing where the shadows of the trees grew denser. Following his gaze, I saw something move. It wasn't human. The figure was tall, its silhouette slender and distorted. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its movements were erratic, as though it moved to a rhythm that didn't belong in our world. A paralyzing fear gripped me, but before I could react, the figure began to advance. Duke charged toward it, barking and growling, but before he could reach it, the thing vanished, dissolving into the mist as if it had never been there. The whistle stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and Duke's frantic barks. I ran back home with Duke at my side. Once inside, I locked every door and window, but the feeling that we were being watched didn't leave. Linda woke up startled when I entered the bedroom, sweating and trembling. "Robert, what happened?" she asked, alarmed. "It's out there. Something's out there. We have to leave." She didn't question me. We began packing our things, but before we could leave, the house was swallowed by an almost tangible darkness. The lights flickered, and the whistle returned, now louder than ever. Duke barked desperately, running back and forth. When I went to the window, I saw something I'll never forget. The figure stood at the edge of the forest, staring directly at me. Its glowing eyes bore into mine, and a twisted smile stretched across its face. Somehow, we managed to leave the house that night. We ran to the car and drove away without looking back. As we sped down the road, the whistle followed us, echoing like a macabre melody. It wasn't until we reached the town that the sound finally stopped. We went straight to a motel where we spent the rest of the night in silence, trying to make sense of what had happened. We never returned to our house in the Blackwater Forest. Whatever we faced that night, it wasn't something that could be explained. The forest held a presence, something ancient and unwelcoming, something that didn't want to be disturbed. Sometimes I still hear the whistle in my dreams,